We're now on page Chaf, about to complete our study of the sugya of Lachmei Toda. And we're on the left column in a paragraph that starts with the letter Beis, and that is Chalos Urikike Noz. So until now, we were speaking about the accompanying Lachmei Toda, that accompany the carbon Toda. Now we're going to talk about the Lechamim that accompany the El Nazi. It's called the El Shlomim of a Nazi. Now, usually, when we talk about El Nazir, it has to do with Isa Veheta, because the entire sugya of Tam Ki Ikar and Taroves really is derived from this particular carbon, because of what's called the Bishul Zroa B'Shela. B'Shela means Bishul, but the Zroa is cooked together with the entire aisle, and the tam of the Zroa goes into the rest of the meat of, so that's called amki. But anyway, that's not relevant to us today. What is relevant to us today is that when the Nazir completes his Nazirus, which in a Stam case means after 30 days, then he has to bring not only El Shlomim, an aisle as a carbon Shlomim, but the aisle has to be accompanied with 20 Lechamim, not 40 like in the case of Lachmei Toda. Here he gets away with 20. And those 20 are divided into two groups of 10 each. And he needs to bring two minim. Both of them are matzah. And these are called chalos urikikim. You may remember that on the previous page, which was Yutes, we had 4 minim for Lachmei Toda. And amongst them, 3 of the 4 minim were made from matzah, and they were called chalos, rikikim, and revuchos. In the case of El Nazir, we only have chalos and rikikim. Those are the only 2 minim that will be brought in both matzah, 10 each, totaling 20, as an accompaniment of the El Shlomim Shel Nazir. In other ways, with regard to other dinim, like for example, we'll talk about the shear, there is an absolute equation between the chalos of the El Shlomim Shel Nazir and the chalos of Lachmei Toda. For example, the shear, if you recall, of each min, which we had a discussion about whether you divide it up into each chala and so forth and so on, was shlosha esrodim ushlish. And that same shear will apply to the chalos and the rikike nos. Now that would mean that each lechem was in the shear of a shlish isara. Okay, that's as far as the lechem is concerned. As far as the shemen is concerned, the shear of the shemen for these 20 matzahs will come in is revius halug. Half of that revius is dedicated to 10 chalos and half to 10 rikikim. Now, 1 lechem of each min would require tnufa together with chaz v'shok and a matana, a truma to the kohen. The rest of the lechem is nechal al yidei abayim. So the nazir will be eating 18 out of 20 of these matzahs. He can divide it up amongst his friends. And 2 of them will be dedicated to the kohen. They'll require tnufa together with the chaz v'shok. There's also, as I said before, this roa habeshela shel el nazir that's also given to the kohen. Question is how the rest of the basar of the korban will be eaten by the bailim, since you cook the zroa together with the rest of the basar. But okay, that's, I said before, that's a Yordei Shayla. That belongs to Masechta Avodah Zarah. Now we get to another item, which is very unique, and that's during the 7 days of Iluim, during which time there was Mashicha of Aaron Ubanov, and they prepared through Chinuch for the avoda in the Mishkan, and on every day of the 7 days of Miluim, together with all the other karbanos, they brought an ayol l'shlamim. The ayol l'shlamim, again, daily during the 7 days of Miluim, had to be accompanied, in this case, not by 20 matzahs, but rather by 30 matzahs, which means there was shlosha minim matzah, each min gets 10 matzahs, and they were number 1, chalos, number 2, rekikim, and number 3, revucha, 10 from each min. So in a sense, we could say that the matzah element of the equation of lachmei toda is identical to that of lachmei el hamiluim. It's the same exact 3 minim, 10 of each min. And with regard to the shear, it's going to again be shlishi saran l'kol lechem, lechem echem mikol min hunach, yachen im ashok v'achazeh, and that's given as a gift to the Kohen. And the murim are burnt on the mizbeh. The other lechamim, which now, if you're taking off 3 from 30, would be 27 lechamim. Those are nechal al yidei Aaron ubanav. And it's on that day and the night afterwards, like all Kodshi Kodshim. Rabosai, here we make a siyum on the sugya of lechamim and the topic of karbanos that require an accompanying lechem, like lachmei toda, el shlomim shel nazir, and el shlomim shel milun. We start a new topic today, Be'ezer Hashem, and that is the karban ha'omer. The omer, which is also going to be part of our subject of menachos, is brought on the 16th of Nisan to be matir chadash. All grains from the new crop, I'll explain what that means, are asur b'toras chadash until the omer is brought. When the omer is brought on the 16th of Nisan, all chadash becomes yosher and it's mut. Now, when I say the new grains are asur until the omer is brought, what I mean is anything that was planted after the 16th of Nisan will be chadash until the following 16th of Nisan. So the omer is only matir that which was planted early, which means, I'll just use contemporary language, that's called winter wheat. It doesn't have to be wheat, it's any of the 5 species of grains, it's spelt and barley and sulfur rye. But what I mean to say is, when I use the term winter, what I mean to say is that this grain was planted during the winter, or before the winter, shortly before the winter. Let's say, for example, after Sukkot, there'll be a planting season. All those grains, when they are harvested, are chadash until the 16th of Nisan. However, there's one little knetch here, and that is that if you planted before the 16th of Nisan, now I'm going to make a general statement and then I'll whittle it down. If you planted before the 16th of Nisan, then Omer is matir even that which is planted in the ground and hasn't yet been harvested. However, and here's the restriction, the limitation, you need what's called hashrosha. Hashrosha means that you don't just put the grain of, the seed of chita, of wheat in the ground, a minute before you brought the omer. That's not enough. You need to wait until the seed took root. That means 72 hours. So 3 days before the 16th of Nisan you planted, then the omer will be matir even that which was planted and was not harvested. But let's talk about spring wheat for a moment. Let's assume that the 16th of Nisan was on April 15th. Just throwing out a possibility. I could actually look it up for this year in the calendar. Now you're in the spring. What happens in a case of spring wheat? So the winter wheat is all yashan. The spring wheat is all chadash. I shouldn't say all chadash because you could have a case of Hashrasha before the 16th of Nisan. But as a general rule, anything that's planted in the spring season is going to be chadash until Tesayim b'Nisan. However, in most countries on the face of the earth, there is no spring planting. There's only one planting. But for example, in the United States of America today, there are two planting seasons. You know, America is a very broad, wide, agricultural, and rich country. They can afford two planting seasons. One in the winter, and that is going to be mutter because it's yashar. Until it gets to the market, it would already have been after Tetzayim ben Nisan. So you may have planted it in November, December, but it's already, you know, May or April by the time you harvest it. So any of the winter wheat that you have, you know, that has reached the market is already yashar because the Omer was matir. Spring wheat will reach the market in the month of November, December, January, February, even before the Omer is born. It was planted after the Omer. So it's chadash. And that's why in America, there's a serious problem of chadash. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about how they avoid that problem. But trust me, it's a problem. Okay. It's not a problem if you're in Skokie, but most places it's a problem. Now, he lists the 5 species of meaning of grains, and we're going to assume that we know what these 5 species are. I'm not sure that we know them, because I don't know if our translation into modern English is the same as what was biblical Chameshes meaning Dogma. And now you planted it after the Omer. If you planted it after the Omer, what we called it spring wheat for our purposes, then it's chadash. You're not allowed to eat it. It's mutar b'hanoah, but you're not allowed to eat it until they bring the Omer. So all the spring wheat, which might reach, in the United States of America, might reach the market as early as November, probably not, but December, January, as early as February. You have, let's say, February, March, and April. There's a lot of stuff out there in the market that's chadash, that was planted after the Omer, spring wheat. And this is derived from the pasuk in Emor. It says, "V'lechem v'koli v'karmel lo tochlu ad etzem hayom hazeh haviechem es korban elokechem chukasol dorsech v'mashosechem." And the phrase "korban elokechem" is a reference to the Omer, and the Omer is brought on the 16th of Nisan. Forget about what the Tzdukim said. Now, if the Tfuah was planted before the Omer and it reached Hashrasha 72 hours after its planting before you reach the Omer, then the Omer is matir, even that which is not harvested. I don't have the grains. All I have is Hashrasha, which means it's rooted under the ground. And now we introduce the opinions of Rabbi Yonah and Rabbi Yossi. According to Rabbi Yonah, all you need is Hashrasha before the Akravas HaOmer, and the Omer is mat. Rabbi Yossi disagrees. He says that you need not only Hashrasha, but Eina Omer Matira Elam Kenechricha Kodem Ktsirasa. Okay, he needs Hashrasha before the Ktsira. And there's going to be a long discussion in the Mefarshim about what Rabbi Yossi has in mind when he says that you need Hishrisho Kodem Ktsirasa. Now, obviously, Hashrasha is before Ktsira. Now we get to Reb Shimon ben Paz. Again, we still owe a debt to Reb Yossi, but we'll talk about Reb Shimon ben Paz. Hiboles sheivia shlish kodem ha'omer. Again, we're not talking about Hashrosha. With regard to Hashrosha, let's take Rabbi Yonah. Rabbi Yonah says that once it was Hashrosha, the Omer is Mati. But now we're talking about a concept called Shlish, otherwise known as Havas Shlish. This is Chadash. Why? Because the Omer hasn't yet passed. He cuts it down and he replants it. And it continues to grow. So it only reached 1/3, let's call it 1/3 of its development. And he cut it down before the Omer. So it never experienced the Omer to be matir. Now he puts it back in the ground after the Omer. Once again, it was not in the ground with Hashrosha at the time of the Omer. It was completely cut. And the Gemara now, in the name of Shimon ben Pazi, on Daf Samach Tes in Menachos, vacillates back and forth. What's the status of these grains, or this grain that was pulled out of the ground before the Omer and replanted after the Omer? Here are the two tzadim in the Suffolk. The first tzad says, Holchim achar ha'ikar. We don't care that the ikar was removed from the ground before the Omer, because it was replanted. So that which is growing now after you replanted after the Omer is a shlish that had the Omer, so to speak. Again, it didn't have the Omer in the sense that it wasn't in the ground, but it was in existence at the time of the Omer. And that which is growing now from that shlish has its, shall I call its base in something that was there before the Omer. So it's almost as if the Omer is matir towards the future. That shlish, but again, only because the shlish was in existence at the time of the Omer. So the fact that you removed it is not mafkia the power or the impact of the Omer on that shlish. The Omer still impacts on that shlish, even though you removed it, because you replanted it. And that which is growing from that shlish. So we take that which is growing and we bring it back to the original shlish as if the Omer was matir the shlish. Why? O Dilma, the Gemara's second suffix is Holchim achar tosefes. Let's look at that which is growing. And that which is growing was not in existence at the time of the Omer. The Einani Teres, Al Yidei Omer. I mean, you have to wait a full year until next year's Omer. It's Chada. So this idea of pulling something out of the ground in order to replant it, and you pulled it out before the Omer, you replanted it after the Omer, could make tremendous headaches, because of the suffix of Shimon ben Pazi, according to one side of that suffix, the Omer cannot be matir because we define this semach, this pri, by its tosefes and not by its shlish. And now we turn to page Chaf Av. Now, we mentioned the parsha in Emor of Chodesh. But when we study the parsha carefully, we break it down into three different parts. First of all, you took the new tefua from this crop, we called it spring wheat, and you made a bread out of it. That bread is awesome. That's called Chodesh. That's number one. Number two, the Torah says that koli is awesome. Awesome. Kuf lamed yud. Again, reading the pasuk, lechem. That's number one. It's lechem. You make lechem out of the tefua. It's chodesh. It's awesome. And now we get to something called koli, and then we'll get to caramel. And the Torah says lo sochlu, even with regard to koli. So what is koli? Koli, and if somebody could give me the English word for it, because I don't know the English word, means that you take the grains, the kernels of wheat, and you bake them in an oven. They become quite sweet. It's like almost like a candy. Probably it means something like cereal. Now, most cereals I don't think are baked in ovens, but you could bake cereal in an oven. Like I eat, for example, bran cereal. So that's called koli. He says it's chitim shehisyabchu b'tanum. They didn't even bother grinding the chitim to make it into a flour. They put it as such in its natural form into the oven, and they dried it. That too is prohibited if it's chodesh. However, there's a Rashi in his commentary on the Torah that gives us different spin on koli. He says, "Kemach ha'osim v'chitim rachos shesyavshu b'tanu." He says they take moist and soft, fresh kernels of wheat, they bake it in the oven and dry it, and then they grind it to make a flour out of it. Now, I don't know what would be the opinion of the first shita, the first explanation. I have a feeling that the first shita, which is anonymous, would reject Rashi because that's not a lav of koli. That would come under lechem. Once you made a flour out of what was koli by drying the kernels in the oven, you've taken out these kernels from the oven and you've made a flour out of it, then you bake a bread. That's prohibited under the word lechem. But Rashi says that since this is an unusual way of creating flour, by drying the fresh kernels in an oven, then it's called koli. Now we get to caramel. What exactly is caramel? This is a major machlokas. Now, Rashi seems to offer different interpretations of caramel in different places in his writings. We're going to start with Rashi in his commentary on Masechta Krisos. And Rashi says the following: Tvua kluya v'tanur b'yoda v'shiboleh. Instead of removing the kernel, the chaff, around the wheat, he takes the entire wheat with its kernel and he roasts it in an oven and he eats it together with the kernel. That's very unusual. And that's called caramel. Ha'ochel mishloshes meaning elu hizayis mikol echamem loke sholosh malchus. Wow. We really have to know how to classify lechem, koli, and caramel, because it's quite possible that it'll violate all these three different isurim, and he'll get 3 sets of malchus if he was warned. That's 39 times 3. That's almost 120. I mean, you have to subtract 3, so call it 137. But it's a massive amount of malchus. And what did he do? He ate a kazayas of each one of these 3 minim. He had a kazayas of lechem that was chodesh, a kazayas of caramel and koli, and he gets 3 sets of malchus. Now, let's say he took lechem that was made of caramel or koli. That was what we touched on earlier. Here we have a machlokas. According to one opinion, he identifies it here with the shutar tzvi, apparently. No, this is the shut achiezer. We'll get to the tzvi next. He says, once he takes koli or caramel and he grinds it down to a flour and adds water and makes it dough and he bakes it in the oven, it becomes lechem. It's no longer koli v'karam. However, the Hartzvi disagrees, and he writes, "Eino nifka isra kodem." The fact that you also upgrade it to a lechem means that it's at the same time it's koli v'karamel and lechem. The lechem does not uproot and undermine its original status. It was already a chefetz d'isura b'toras 1 lav. Could be that according to the Achiezer, since the Torah called lechem by its name, making it a separate category with its own lav, the Torah is saying that anything that becomes lechem is lechem, and it's osur as such. It's not osur as karmit, as koli v'karmel. Now, what would happen if he ate the grains themselves? In every one of these 3 categories, he processed the grain. In the case of koli, he took chitim and he dried it in the oven, and they weren't ground. In the case of caramel, Rashi tells us that he took the original kernel without removing its chaff. And in the case of lechem, clearly, he grinds down the tefua, makes a flour, and then he bakes the bread. What happens if he just eats straight away the kernel itself without any process whatsoever, without baking it, without grinding it? So he quotes here the Pearl out, which we quoted interestingly in the last 2 shiurim in Yevamos. Right, Rabbi Yerucham Perla. And Rabbi Yerucham Perla, in his commentary on the Rasag Sefer Mitzvahs, writes that in this case he violates the Isur Chadash, which is fascinating when you think about it. The Torah says lechem koli v'karmel lo sofu. It doesn't say chadash lo sofu. But yet, according to his opinion in Rav Tzadikon, there's an isur to eat chadash per se, even if it's not neither lechem, koli, or karm. Now, when the Beis Hamikdash stood, then the heter of eating chadash depended upon the hakravas ha'omer. Before the omer was actually brought, there was no heter. Now, places that were far away didn't get the word; they didn't know whether the omer was brought or not. So lo nodalahem, they knew at 1 hour during the day they would bring the omer, and we assume wherever we are that by chatzos yom, by midday, the omer was brought on the 17th, on the 16th of Nisan. And somchal kachalo misatzlim hakohanim. You hear this, Don? Kohanim are not lazy. Kohanim are reason. And therefore, by Chatzos Yom, they certainly would have brought the Yom. Now, after the Mikdash was destroyed, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai established that we have to wait until the entire day passes. In other words, we're already up to the 17th of Nisan. The 16th of Nisan is Asur Midin Chadash. And Rabbi Yehuda disagrees. He says, Bisman Sheisem Ein Abigdus Kaddish Yom Tezvav. No, I'm sorry. Yom Tezayin Asur Kulo Min Torah. Not the way Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai understood that this is a Durabanan, that we have to wait until the end of the day. And basically, according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, on the day itself, it's mutter, but the Rabbanan made it zero. Rabbi Yehuda holds that the day itself is also ben Torah. Now, what is the logic of Rabbi Yehuda? So the Gemara applies the principle of Shnei Ksuvim Nemru. The Torah says in Pashas Emor, Ad Etzem Hayom Hazeh, and then it has a pasuk that says, Ad Haviachem Es Korban Elokechem. So what does it mean when it says on the one in Etzem Hayom Hazeh, that the Yom itself is Matir Chadash, and yet it says, Ad Haviachem, it's still Yosh, it's still Chadash until you bring the Yom. Ella, but rather says Rabbi Yehuda, these two parts of the pasuk are referring to two different periods of time in Jewish history. Bisman shebeis hamikdash kayam, then we apply the principle ad hafiach hanasak karban. We have to wait till the Omer is matir. But if the mikdash is not there, then we apply the principle of ad etzem hayom hazeh, which means the entire day. That's called ad v'ad b'chlal. The entire day is us. Now, the Shita of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is the subject of a great sugya with regard to the Isur D'Rabbanan, which on a D'Oraisa level would be mutter, of waiting until the 17th of Nisan. So that in Mirz Hashem we'll pick up tomorrow. Let's just make a note of where we got up to. Here on Chaf Al. So Steve, if you have a chance, maybe you could photocopy Chaf Beis, because very shortly